Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the excellent wife of Proverbs chapter 31 in our continuing study of the poetic books of the Old Testament. Proverbs 31 verse 10 starts us off, an excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. Now, when we read this, one of the things I want to note that there's 22 verses in this description, and there's 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and we start off, in Hebrew, the first verse here starts off with the letter Aleph, and then the verse 11 is the verse will start off with the Hebrew letter Beit and Gimel and Daleth, and it will take us on a tour of the Hebrew alphabet in the similar way to what Psalm 119 did, where you had the first 8 verses start off with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then Beit, and then Gimel and Daleth, and so on. So it's an acrostic proverb as we walk through this excellent wife. Now, that phrase, excellent wife, and I've used this in the title, but a Eshet Ha'il is really a woman of might, or I like almost a woman of valor. I say that because 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 9, you have that same word used in describing David's mighty men, and we read that there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men of valor who drew the sword. And here's a woman of valor, a woman of might. We read about this woman of might that her worth is far above, my translation says jewels. The Hebrew has the Hebrew word for coral, which, if you think about it, the Jewish people were landlubbers. They were a desert people, and so they didn't think too much of going into the ocean. That's a dangerous place, and so coral was a very valuable commodity for them, more valuable than jewels. And so our translators want to get that idea, because for us, coral isn't a very valuable thing. You just pick some up at the swap shop, especially if you live down here in South Florida like I do. But in that day, that was a valuable thing. So her worth is far above that which is valuable. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Now, that phrase gain, shalal, normally we translate that booty. For example, we read that Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey. In the evening he divides the spoil. That word spoil there is our word shalal, gain or prey or something that you took in battle. Again, the term is used in 2 Samuel 3:22, and behold, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. And it's not that this wife of power is going out robbing people. No. But he is the beneficiary of her actions, her financial actions. Verses 12 through 14, she does him good and not evil. All the days of her life she looks for wool and flax and works with her hands in delight. She is like merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. This woman of valor, this woman of strength, is a blessing and a help financially even to her husband. Verses 15 and 16, she rises also while it is still night, and gives food to her household and portions to her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. From her earnings she plants a vineyard. And this picture of her is as a businesswoman in a day and an age when there were no businesswomen. It was a very sort of unusual thing. So in this sense, she sort of presses the boundaries, but in a good way, in a way that brings blessing to her family. Verse 17, she girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She senses that her gain is good. Her lamp does not go out at night. She's planned ahead, by the way, because with an oil lamp, that's what they use when they refer to a lamp. She planned enough so that she would have the lamp throughout the night. Verse 19, she stretches out her hand to the staff, and her hands grasp the spindle. In other words, she's involved in clothing, in manufacturing, in This is Superwoman. She's doing all sorts of wonderful things for her family and those with whom she comes into contact. Verse 20, she extends her hand to the poor, and she stretches out her hands to the needy. She has a heart not just for her family, but for others in need as well. And yet she doesn't ignore her family. Verse 21, she's not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet, and that's the idea they're clothed well. Verse 22, she makes covering for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Now, purple was that's the sort of language of royalty, and it's not that she is saying to her husband, "Go out and buy me all these new dresses," but she's providing for herself and for her family, and providing well, and that's okay. Verse 23, her husband is known in the gates. Now the gates, that was sort of we think of a gate as just the place where you go in and out of, but the gate was sort of the heart of the city. It's the place where everybody gathered. And her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. His claim to fame is that she is his wife. Verse 24, she makes linen garments and sells them and supplies belts to the tradesmen. Strength and dignity are her clothing. And she smiles at the future because she's prepared. She's prepared her family, and she's prepared herself for the future, for the unknown. Verse 26, she opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. Yes, there's wisdom there, but remember, wisdom in the Proverbs is also good. And she's a woman who is both wise and good. Verse 27, she looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. There's a certain busyness to her, but it's a good busyness. Verse 28, her children rise up and bless her, her husband also, and he praises her, saying, many daughters have done nobly, but you excel them all. Notice her husband has praise in the gates of the city, but she has praise too from her husband and from her children. Verses 30 and 31, and here we sum up. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. There's a quality that's much better than charm or beauty. Give her the product of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So notice, in the gates, her husband is praised, but her works praise her in the gates as well. Now, some closing lessons from the Proverbs. The Proverbs remind us of the universal need for wisdom. We all need wisdom, whether we're young or we're old or we're in between, but also the universal arena of wisdom, because wisdom covers every area of life, whether the workplace or the home place or in the gate of the city or when you're in the country. Every area is impacted by wisdom. Also, what is wise is also good. And we've noted this before, that there's a moral quality to wisdom. That it's not like the world's wisdom that says, it's wise to go and cheat and steal. No, what is wise is good. And what is good is wise. We've asked the question before, are these principles rather than promises? And my answer is that we need to take all the Proverbs in tension together. There's no standalone proverb where you just take that one and ignore all the others. And when we take them all, then we see that these principles, and yes, even promises from God, are there, and yet we need to understand that no one proverb tells the whole story. The Proverbs give us a real view of the real world. And sometimes that's not a nice view, because sometimes this world can be a nasty place. And the Proverbs show us that. Which means, and I'm borrowing this from one of my old teachers, Steve Brown, used to say that Christians are called to be street smart. I like that. I think we are called to have a certain streetwise wisdom of the way things work in our world.